Well, good morning, church family. It is good to be together with you, and I hope that we get to be together again after the second service for the barbecue. You know, we are in kind of a pattern of every other month we have a lunch that is for newcomers. And this month we're not having a newcomers lunch, so if you are new to the church and you want that opportunity to get together with people, to meet leadership, and to find out what CCBC is like, well, come have a barbecue with us. And even if you weren't planning on it, stick around today and eat food and get to know people and ask questions about the church and find out what it is like to be a part of this community. Well, today, as Carl mentioned, we are moving into a new series through Ruth. We have been in 1st and 2nd Timothy for 4 months. And now we're going to spend 4 weeks in Ruth and then 8 weeks in Esther, because Esther's a longer book, and that will take us through the end of the summer. But if you know me, you might know what I'm going to say. And that is, before we look ahead, let's look back. Because I always challenge us to remind ourselves of what we've talked about, remind ourselves of what God has said, because we are so quick to forget, aren't we? Yes. And I hope that over the last 4 months, as we have studied 1st and 2nd Timothy, that God has said something to you, that you've learned something new, that He's challenged you, that He's given you an application. I hope there's something that you don't want to forget, that there's something that you want to take with you. And your application might be different than mine, but for me, there are 2 things that I think are going to continue to stick with me from our time in 1st and 2nd Timothy. From 1st Timothy, it was Paul's purpose statement for the church. He says that the goal of this command, the goal of everything that he's telling us, is love. That we would be displaying God's love to each other through the community. And he says that this love comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. A pure heart means a heart that is cleansed from sin. A good conscience means a mind that is set on God, and a sincere faith means a faith that is put into action. So if we are cleansed from sin by the blood of Christ, if we have our minds set on God, and if we have a faith that is living itself out in action, then we're going to be able to show God's love to one another in the community. And then the thing that stood out to me through 2 Timothy was his challenge for each one of us to fan into flame the calling that God has for each one of us. Because for every single one of us, God has placed a calling on our lives. And if you remember, it was before the foundation of the world, before the creation of the universe, that God had a calling for each one of us. And we need to discover and develop that calling and put it to use in the community for the good of the body. And so if we can do those 2 things, I think we are well on our way to becoming the kind of church that God has designed us to be. Amen? All right, well, as we move into Ruth, we need to understand the difference between reading a New Testament epistle and reading an Old Testament historical narrative. Because in the epistles, as Paul's writing letters to the churches, he spells things out pretty clearly. This is what you need to know, and this is what you need to do. But as we read the historical narrative, we read the account of events that transpired in history. There's great lessons there for us about God and about the way that He designed us to live in relationship with Him. But we need to work a little bit harder to draw those lessons out of the text. And we need to be able to relate to the story and to see ourselves in the story and to understand how we relate to the characters in the story, how our life might be like the life of Ruth or Naomi or Boaz, and how the struggles they had might be like our struggles, and the decisions they faced might be like our decisions. So as we begin to imagine their world and what they were going through, let's look at the first few words of Ruth. It says that in the days when the judges ruled. So this story, these events took place during the time of the judges, after the leadership of Moses and Joshua, but before the establishment of the king David and his descendants. And so it's in this middle period, this void, this vacuum. And if you've read the book of Judges, you know that it was one of the darkest periods of Israel's history. And the phrase that comes up over and over again is that every person did as they saw fit. In fact, in 2 Chronicles, written several generations later, we see them looking back to the period of Judges, and they described it this way. For a long time, Israel was without the true God. Israel was without the true God. Can you imagine that? Without a priest to teach and without the law. In those days, it was not safe to travel about, for all the inhabitants of the land were in great turmoil. One nation was being crushed by another, and one city by another, because God was troubling them with every kind of distress. So we have social upheaval, political instability, and moral relativism. What does that sound like? Now, do you think that this is a story that we are going to be able to relate to? But throughout the book of Judges, each one of the stories focuses on these larger-than-life figures. The judges, the military leaders, people who confronted kings. And we can't really connect to what their experience because it's so different than our own. But in the book of Ruth, we see a simple family trying to figure out what it means to live faithfully in the midst of all of that. So we have social upheaval, political instability, and moral relativism, and a simple family trying to figure out what it means to follow God in the midst of a world like that. As we read through the book, there's 3 themes that I think are going to stand out to us in each one of the chapters. And the first theme is God's sovereignty and human choice. Because as we work through the book, we're going to see many important decisions that the people in the story are going to face. And they make some good decisions and they make some bad decisions. There are some choices that turn out well and there's some choices that turn out poorly. But through all of those decisions, we see God's sovereign plan at work. And at the end of the story, we see that God has brought us exactly where he intended, which is the establishment of the line of King David and ultimately of King Jesus. So through all those human decisions, God was at work. And the second theme that we're going to see is God's hesed on display through his people. Now, hesed is a Hebrew word that I hope is becoming more familiar to us. It has a broad meaning, but it's translated steadfastness, faithfulness, and loving kindness. And so we see God's loving kindness, God's steadfast faithfulness on display through the actions of his people. It's interesting that throughout the book of Ruth, there are 6 prayers offered by different individuals in which we get to see the prayer answered by the end of the story. And in all 6 of those prayers, God's answer comes through the actions of another person. I think that that's a great lesson for us in the church because I know this morning that many of us are offering up prayers, and the answer to those prayers might be sitting right next to us. Or you might be sitting next to somebody that you don't even know, and they're offering up a prayer to God, and God might put you in the position to be the answer to their prayer. God answers prayers through the actions of his people. And the third theme is God's redemption, specifically through the kinsman redeemer. Because throughout the Old Testament, God gives us these examples, these illustrations that point us forward, that prepared them for what God was going to do in Jesus Christ. And for us, looking back, they help us understand more about what God accomplished for us in Jesus Christ. And so I think of Abraham as he's about to sacrifice his son Isaac, when God steps in and he provides the lamb for the sacrifice. And that points us forward to Jesus, who is the sacrificial lamb, who takes our place, who bears our sin so that our sin is forgiven and our relationship with God is restored. And now in Ruth, we see God as the kinsman redeemer who rescues Ruth and Naomi out of their helplessness and gives them hope in a future. So just as Jesus is our sacrificial lamb, forgives our sin and restores our relationship with God, Jesus, as our kinsman redeemer, rescues us from our hopelessness and gives us life and a future. Well, all of that is what's in store over the next 4 weeks as we work our way through Ruth. So before we get into the text this morning, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for your word that is true and authoritative. And we thank you for your Holy Spirit that guides us into truth. And this morning, as we open your word together, we pray that your Spirit would be at work in our hearts, that you would speak your truth into our lives, that you would guide each one of us to exactly what we need to hear from you this morning. We thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're not going to read straight through the entire chapter because it's a long chapter. We're going to take one section at a time and talk about it as we go. So in the first 2 verses, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled," and we can picture what that was like. "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there." So we have a family of Ephrathites, and the Ephrathites was a clan within the tribe of Judah. So you have a tribe, and then you have a clan, and a clan was large enough to encompass several cities. So it might be like a county for us today. And this family is from the tribe of Judah, from the clan of Ephraim and the city of Bethlehem. You might recognize that name, Bethlehem Ephrathah, from Micah 2, which says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." And so this prophecy that Micah gave some 700 years after Ruth, we can already see the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophecy in the story of Ruth, as God establishes in Bethlehem the lineage of Jesus. There's several other names given to us in these first 2 chapters, and the names are very significant because the meaning of the names gives us insight into what's going on in the lives of the people. So first of all, we have Elimelech. El is the Hebrew word for God. E is the first person possessive, so Le is my God, and Melech is king. So Elimelech means my God is king. And Naomi means pleasant. So we have my God is king, and we have pleasant. And then they have 2 children, and Mahlon comes from the Hebrew root meaning sickly or sickness. And then Chilion comes from a root that can mean emptiness or desolation or tiredness. And I like that last definition, tiredness, because then we have these 2 kids, sick and tired. And so who do the names of the children ultimately reflect upon? The parents, right? Because you don't choose your name, it's given to your parents. And so often throughout the Old Testament, we see parents giving names that reflect the situation in which the child was born. And so if we think about the grandparents who aren't mentioned in the story, but the parents of Elimelech and the parents of Naomi, for them, God was king and life was pleasant. But a generation later, when Elimelech and Naomi are naming their children, they're just sick and tired. And I think we can relate to that because I think we can look back a generation to a time when it was easier to see that God was king and easier to say that life was pleasant. And a generation later, we look around and we just feel sick and tired. Does anybody else feel sick and tired of the world that we're in right now? So you can relate to Elimelech and to Naomi. They're feeling sick and tired. And on top of this, they're already feeling sick and tired, and now there's a famine in Bethlehem. And the name Bethlehem means the house of bread. And it's not an arbitrary or meaningless name. It was given for a purpose because Bethlehem was good, fertile land where the crops grew well. Bethlehem was the breadbasket of Israel. They always had food. They always had abundance. But now there's a famine in the house of bread. And that sounds like a contradiction, and it makes us ask, why? Why is there a famine in the house of bread? Well, if we think about what we said about the period of Judges, we can start to answer that question. Because I think of the end of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 28, as Moses is preparing the Israelites to go into the land, he leads them in this covenant renewal ceremony where he lists for them all of the blessings that are going to come in the land if they're faithful to Yahweh. And then he lists all the curses that are going to come upon them in the land if they are not faithful. In Deuteronomy 28, he says, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed, and the crops of your land, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flock. You will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. The Lord will send on you curses, confusion, and rebuke in everything you put your hand to until you are destroyed and come to sudden ruin because of the evil you have done in forsaking him. So during this time, not each individual, not every family, but Israel as a whole has turned away from God, and he's done exactly what he said he would do. Because God's faithfulness takes two forms, right? It means living up to the good things that he promises, but it also means living up to the negative things that he warns us about, right? And so God's faithful to what he said through Moses, and now there is a famine in the land because Israel has been unfaithful. And this famine leads to the first major decision, because Elimelech and Naomi have to ask, what are we going to do? There's not enough food here. They knew that this was the land that God had promised them. They knew that this was the place God had called them. But it had gotten hard. It wasn't what they had pictured. And so are they going to stay and are they going to tough it out? Are they going to wait for God's deliverance? Or are they going to get up and leave? And they decide to get up and leave. And the place that they go to, Moab, is another really important thing for us to understand, because Moab, the Moabites, were the descendants of Lot through his incestuous relationship with his daughters, and they themselves were under a curse. They were constantly at war with Israel, and even during the period of the Judges, we read about wars between Israel and Moab. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, who was worshipped through child sacrifice. And because of all these things, Deuteronomy 23 said that no descendant of a Moabite was allowed to enter the temple down to the 10th generation. And so this is the spiritual environment that they're taking their family to. And so as bad as Israel was as they were walking away from God, it was nothing compared to the situation in Moab. But the family makes an economic decision. They say, we are going to sacrifice the spiritual welfare of our family to pursue economic prosperity. And even as we phrase it that way, I think in your gut you probably know what's going to happen. You probably know how that's going to turn out for them. But we face similar situations, don't we? And I don't know if there's something that you have felt God call you to. God has spoken to you and said, here is the thing you need to be doing. But it's gotten hard, and it feels easy to get up and to walk away. Don't walk away from what God has called you to do. Well, let's continue and see what happens. In verse 3, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So it didn't go like they thought. Naomi's husband dies, and she's left a widow. But at least she has her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And her sons take Moabite wives, which was against the law for a reason. These are women who would have come from families that were worshipers of Chemosh, and they would have brought that worship into the family with them. But they had to know that was coming. When Elimelech and Naomi made the decision to take their family to Moab, they had to understand that probably meant their sons were going to find wives among the Moabite women. And as a parent, I know that there are a few things that you want for your children. First of all, you want your children to be walking with the Lord. And probably the second biggest thing you want for your child is that they find the right spouse. But Elimelech and Naomi made a decision that led to this situation, and where their sons are marrying Moabite women. And we don't know in the story how that played out and how that mixture of religion took place within their family, but I think we can see the continuation of that downward trend in the family as they continue to move farther and farther away from God, first by leaving the land, and now by marrying these women who come from families who are worshipers of Chemosh. But then the sons die, and Naomi is left with just her daughters-in-law. Just the three of them, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, 3 widows. And we read in verse 6 that when she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. In the beginning of this verse, I think we get a little bit of a glimpse of what could have been. What could have been if their decision had been different? Because not everybody picked up and left Bethlehem. There are people who stayed, there are people who toughed it out, there are people who waited for God's deliverance, and they experienced God's provision. Naomi, as we'll see later, still has friends, still has neighbors who stayed in Bethlehem, and now God has come to their aid and provided for them. And it doesn't say this in the story, but I have to imagine that Naomi felt a little bit of regret as she looks back to the lives of the people that she had known in Moab, back in Bethlehem, and thinks about what could have been if their choice had been different. And she makes a decision to return. And that's the second important decision. She makes the decision to return. I heard a phrase this week that I think was so important. And this isn't a direct quote, but this is a paraphrase. But no matter how far you have run from God, he's only a step away. Because all you need to do is turn around. That's what repentance means. It means to turn around 160 degrees. And you could have been running as fast as you can for years, running away from God. But as soon as you turn around, he's right there. I think that's amazing. And Naomi makes this decision to turn around and to start walking back towards God. So we have 3 widows on the road, on the way back to Judah. And it's not, even though that's encouraging, we need to understand what awaited them there. It wasn't going to be easy because in Israel, a widow couldn't own land, had no way of providing for herself. She was going to be completely dependent on the charity of others. It was not going to be a very good life. And I think she's recognizing that, and I think that's part of why she turns to her 2 daughters-in-law and says to them, you know, girls, this is going to be pretty tough. Why don't you turn around? Why don't you go back home? Why don't you go make a life for yourselves in Moab, meet a nice young Moabite man, and go worship Chemosh together? Because that life is going to be a lot easier for you. And at first, both of them say, no, we're going to stay with you. But in the end, Orpah's convinced, and she goes back. But Ruth is not convinced, and she continues on with Naomi. And especially with the emphasis that I see in this story on the decisions that we make, I don't think it's a coincidence that we have 2 women that are faced with the same decision. Because I don't know if you've ever come to a point in your life where you meet a fork in the road and you can go left or you can go right. But you know that whichever way you go, there's no going back. And things are never going to be the same. So here these 2 women meet this fork in the road, and Orpah goes left. She goes back to her people, she goes back to their God, and we never hear from her again. But Ruth takes the path to the right, and she starts walking she starts walking forward to Israel, to the land of Yahweh. And she says in verse 16, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." And I think that we're intended to take this as Ruth's conversion. Because here she is placing her faith in Yahweh. She's placing her trust in the God of Israel. She knows that she is going to be fully dependent on Yahweh for her provision and for her deliverance. And she says, for better or worse, in life or death, I'm walking towards Yahweh. He is going to be my God. And one of the amazing things that we're going to see as we see the way that God brings her into the fold, brings her into the family, is to look back and remember where she came from. She was an outsider. She was a Moabite. She should have been ostracized from the community, but we see God's love and concern for her as he brings her in to the family of his people. And I don't know if you've ever been in the church and you felt like an outsider. I don't know if you've ever looked around and said, well, everybody else has it all together, but not me. I don't fit in. Boy, I hope we don't look like we all have it together. If anybody's got it all together, you want to raise your hand? We are all broken. We are all struggling. We are all in this together. But we are all experiencing God's healing. We are all experiencing God's restoration. And we are all on that journey as God slowly, painfully makes us more and more like his Son. That's who we are together as a community. So if you are ever sitting here and you are feeling like an outsider, look around you because you're in a room full of outsiders. We are all outsiders, foreigners, aliens who have been adopted into God's family and declared God's children. So we see Ruth as she places her trust in Yahweh. He will be my God. And the two of them head on their way back to Jerusalem. Sorry, not to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem in Judah. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" So we see those women who never left, who stayed, and they're ready to welcome her back. The prodigal daughter has returned. She walked away, but she has come back. But Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. Call me bitterness, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So even though she made the decision to come back, she's not all the way back, is she? She's holding on to some real bitterness here. And the bitterness that she has comes from blame. And I think that's so often true for all of us, that bitterness comes from blame. She's looking at everything negative that's happened in her life, and she's putting the blame on someone else. In this case, she's putting the blame on Yahweh. And she says, I went away full, but he has dealt harshly with me, and he has brought me back empty. Now, we just read that story. Does that feel like a little bit of a revisionist history? Does it feel like she's kind of reshaping the facts? Because when she was in Bethlehem, God had blessed her. He had given her a husband. He had given her sons, and they made the decision to walk away from him. And so that everything that happens in Moab is a result of her decision to walk away. And now that she's returning because she sees God blessing the people in Bethlehem. So she has this picture in her mind that I had it so good. I had done so well for myself, but then God did all this terrible stuff to me. And I don't know if you can relate to that, if you've ever experienced real tragedy in your life, and you want to put it on God and say, God did that to me. But here in Naomi, we see that everything good had come from God, and pretty much everything bad had come from her own decisions. But she's blaming God, and it creates this bitterness inside of her. And if you have this bitterness inside of you, let that go. Stop blaming. Take ownership and look to God for healing through that. You know, it's easy for us to have that perspective on Naomi's story because we see 10 years of her life consolidated into one page. It was probably harder for her to have that perspective as she sees this play out slowly over the years. And I think the same thing is probably true of us. If you could have like the last 10 years of your life, all of the major decisions that you've made and all of the ramifications that have come from them consolidated onto one page, you might be able to see clearly how the different things that have come about in your life have been a result of those decisions. You might be able to see places that God sustained you, that God cared for you. You might be able to see times when you maybe took steps away from God. And so as you think back about the decisions you made, or you think forward about the decisions you're facing, think about the trajectory that those decisions place you on. Are you walking away from God, or are you walking towards God? And this must be the holy side of the room, because I realized every time I say walk away from God, it's over here. And every time I'm walking towards God, it's over here. So maybe next service we can all sit over there. But the point is, which way are you headed? Where are your choices taking you? What choices do you have before you? And will you choose the path that's going to take you to God? Will you persist? Will you persevere in what God has put before you, what God has called you to? Or are you going to walk away? The last verse reminds me of the end of an episode of a TV series. I don't know if you've watched a TV series where you get to the end of an episode and it feels like the story is resolved, but then there's one more scene. And the scene gives you a little teaser of what's coming next week. Or if you're a fan of the Marvel movies, maybe you have the end credit scene that comes at the end and gives you a little glimpse of what's to come. And this last verse is a little bit of an end credit scene. It's a teaser that points us forward to next week. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And the barley harvest sets the stage for what we're going to read about next week. But Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem. They're walking towards God. They're in a place where they can experience God's provision. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to continue to see God's deliverance and God's provision to Naomi, to Ruth, to Boaz, and to us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your sovereignty that weaves its way through every decision of our lives. And that even as we have made choices to walk away from you, you have remained faithful, that you are still in control, and that you are never more than a step away when we turn back to you. God, whatever decisions we are facing this morning, I pray that your Holy Spirit would go before us and would lead us on the road that's leading back to you. We thank you, we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.